On a summer morning in June 1775, the hills above Boston erupted in fire. Red-coated British soldiers advanced in rigid lines, bayonets fixed, drums pounding, their scarlet uniforms flashing against the smoke. But with every step forward, the hillside answered with thunder muskets cracked from behind crude earthworks. And entire ranks of men fell in waves, their bright coats darkening in the dirt. This was no distant skirmish, it was a storm of fire. Fought at arm's length, where powder smoke blinded the air and screams carried across the harbor. Farmers and shopkeepers, men who had never seen real war, held their ground against the most feared army in the world. Their hands shook from exhaustion, their powder horns nearly empty, but their aim was steady. By day's end, the British would take the hill, planting their flag where American militia had stood. Yet the ground they won was paid, for in blood, nearly half their force lay dead or wounded. What should have been an easy triumph became a sobering warning. This rebellion would not be crushed so quickly. The Battle of Bunker Hill, fought mostly on nearby Breed's Hill, became more than a clash of muskets. It was a message, written in smoke and sacrifice, that the birth of a nation would not come quietly. In the spring of 1775, Boston was a city under lock and key. British redcoats patrolled its narrow streets, their muskets glinting in the sunlight, while cannons from warships in the harbor aimed silently at the town below. The rebellion that began at Lexington and Concord only weeks earlier had transformed this port into a prison. Inside Boston, thousands of loyalists clung to the security of British bayonets, while patriots fled or plotted in secret outside. A ring of colonial militia tightened its grip. Farmers, blacksmiths, and fishermen had left their fields and families to form a crude army. They were poorly equipped, many carrying old hunting muskets or even farm tools. But what they lacked in training, they made up for with conviction. The standoff was tense every night. Campfires glowed along the ridges surrounding the city every morning. British sentries watched those flames flicker out, knowing the rebels were waiting just beyond their reach. It was not a siege of walls and gates, but of patience. A slow strangling of the city food grew scarce, tempers flared. The question hung heavy in the summer air. Who would strike first? The answer came with a decision by the colonial leadership. They could not match British firepower, but they could seize the heights around Boston. If the rebels built defenses on those hills, they could choke the British in their own harbor, and so, under cover of darkness, ordinary men prepared to move their shovels, picks, and courage toward the hilltops that overlooked the city. What began as a standoff was about to ignite into one of the bloodiest days of the Revolution. On the night of June 16, 1775, silence cloaked the Charlestown Peninsula. By order of colonial commanders, 1,200 men marched quietly under the stars. Led by Colonel William Prescott, they carried no drums, no banners, no fanfare. Instead, they hauled shovels, pickaxes, and bundles of timber. Their destination, Breed's Hill, a rise of ground just beyond Boston, close enough to threaten the British fleet in the harbor. It was a dangerous gamble. The men knew that if they were discovered before dawn, British artillery from the ships below could tear them to pieces. Yet fear did not stop them by midnight. Prescott's force reached the crest, and the digging began. Shovels bit into rocky soil, timber posts were driven deep, earth piled higher and higher as the hours slipped away. Each man worked feverishly, sweat mixing with the dust of the hill, their eyes darting toward Boston, where lanterns glowed faintly in windows from across the water. British sentries thought they saw movement, but in the darkness, the rebels' frantic labor was mistaken for shadows. By morning, the colonists had achieved the unthinkable. Where the hill had stood bare the night before, now rose a formidable earthwork, walls of dirt and timber strong enough to deflect musket fire and even resist cannonballs. Exhausted men leaned on their shovels, gazing at the fortress they had built in a single night. When the sun broke across the harbor, Boston awoke to a shocking sight. The king's army stared across the water to see a new rebel stronghold bristling above them. A fortress that threatened both their ships and their pride. British officers, furious at this defiance, vowed to tear it down before the day was out. But for the men who had dug through the night, Breed's Hill was more than a defensive position. It was a statement carved in earth and sweat, that these farmers and tradesmen were no longer mere subjects of an empire. They were defenders of their own land, willing to build, bleed, and if necessary, die upon the soil beneath their feet. The stage was set. The empire would not tolerate such defiance, and the hill, still fresh with raw earth, would soon run red. The morning of June 17th dawned hot and bright. From the decks of British warships anchored in Boston Harbor, officers raised spyglasses to their eyes and scowled across the water. Breed's Hill now bristled with rebel earthworks, daringly close to their fleet. The insult was intolerable. General William Howe, confident in his soldiers' discipline, declared he would sweep the hill clean of rebels by noon. At midday, the order was given. Ferries crowded with scarlet-coated troops crossed the harbor and landed on the Charlestown shore. As they formed ranks, the spectacle was overwhelming. Neat rows of soldiers in brilliant red, white crossbelts gleaming, bayonets glinting in the sunlight. Drums beat a steady cadence, flags fluttered above the lines. The proud symbols of the world's greatest empire. On the hilltop, Colonel William Prescott's men watched grimly. Exhaustion still clung to their bodies from the night's labor, but adrenaline now surged through their veins. Many had never faced battle before. They had no bayonets, little ammunition, and only the crude protection of their hastily built earthworks. Some whispered prayers, others gripped their muskets tighter, while Prescott himself walked calmly along the line, promising his men that the hill would hold. Then came the fire from the harbor. British ships unleashed a barrage of cannon fire, their thunder echoing across the peninsula. Charlestown's houses burst into flame as the bombardment lit the town ablaze, smoke curling into the summer sky. The ground shook, but the men behind the earthworks stood firm. When the cannon fell silent, the redcoats advanced. Drums pounded, fifes shrieked, and the British regulars marched in perfect formation, their bayonets lowered like a wall of steel. Step by step, they climbed the hill, certain the rebel militia would scatter before them. But the rebels did not scatter. Prescott's famous order spread along the line. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Whether spoken by him or by another officer that day, the meaning was clear. Wait, hold, conserve every precious shot. The tension was unbearable. The distance between the lines closed. 200 yards. 100. The British bayonets glistened in the sun. Then, when the enemy was nearly upon them, the hill erupted. Muskets fired in unison. Flames and smoke burst from the earthworks. The front ranks of redcoats collapsed as though the ground itself had swallowed them. Shock rippled through the British lines. The order has become legend. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Some claim it was Colonel Prescott. Others say it was General Israel Putnam. Perhaps many officers repeated it that day. But whether spoken once or a dozen times, its meaning was unmistakable. Hold, wait, make every shot count. Behind the earthen walls, the rebels clenched their jaws, sweat stinging their eyes. They had perhaps 15 rounds of powder each, no more. A single wasted shot could mean death. And so they waited as the sea of scarlet surged uphill. The first British assault came with martial precision. Drums thundered, fifes shrieked, and bayonets gleamed like a field of silver. Officers barked commands as their men climbed steadily, confident that the militia would break under the pressure. But at just 30 yards, the rebel earthworks exploded in smoke and fire. The effect was devastating. Whole lines of redcoats crumpled to the ground. Mowed down in an instant, officers fell beside their men. Survivors stumbled backward, colliding with the ranks behind them. The proud advance dissolved into chaos. Within minutes, the finest army in the world had been repelled by farmers and tradesmen standing behind a wall of dirt. Howe, furious but unshaken, rallied his men for a second assault this time. They wheeled artillery into position, cannonballs tearing through the earthworks and sending plumes of dirt and timber into the air. Once again, the red ranks reformed, steadying their lines as smoke from burning Charlestown rolled across the battlefield. Again the order was passed along the hill. Wait, hold your fire. The rebels crouched low, muskets leveled, hearts pounding. The British came on, bayonets lowered, faces grim. The distance closed 50 yards, 30-20. Then the hill roared once more. Another storm of lead tore through the advancing troops. The effect was as brutal as the first volley. British soldiers dropped in heaps, their scarlet coats staining the grass. Officers fell trying to rally their men. Again the redcoats broke, retreating downhill under the relentless fire of men they had dismissed as amateurs. In 1 hour, the Empire had been driven back. And yet, on the hill, the militia's victory came with a cost of its own. Powder horns were nearly empty. Muskets leaned uselessly against the earthworks, their charges spent. The men knew one more assault was coming, and this time, their ammunition would not last. The question that hung in the smoke-filled air was not whether the British would come again. It was whether the rebels, with courage alone, could withstand the fury of a third attack. Among the men on Breed's Hill that day was a figure of unusual stature. Dr. Joseph Warren, a respected physician and fiery patriot leader, had been offered command of the militia. He refused. "I will not seek command," he said. "I come as a soldier to fight where the battle is hottest." Warren was already a marked man in the eyes of the Crown. His speeches had ignited rebellion in Boston. His presence at Lexington and Concord had stirred the fire that now consumed Massachusetts. And yet, here he stood, musket in hand, alongside farmers and laborers, willing to face whatever came up the hill. When the British prepared for their third assault, the rebels' strength was faltering, ammunition was nearly gone. Some men had only a single round left, others none at all. Bayonets, which the British carried in abundance, were scarce among the militia. The defenders braced themselves for the inevitable, that this fight would come down to cold steel and courage. The redcoats came again, climbing through the smoke of burning Charlestown. Their pace was slower now. Their ranks thinned. Their faces hardened by loss, they advanced grimly. Bayonets glistening in the sunlight, drums pounded, and officers shouted them forward, determined that this third charge would not fail. Behind the earthworks, Warren stood near the front line, encouraging the men not to falter. When the order to fire came, the volleys were scattered, weaker, fewer. Then the powder ran dry. The rebels fought on with stones, the butts of their muskets, even bare hands, but the bayonets of the British pressed relentlessly forward. In the chaos of that desperate clash, Joseph Warren fell. A musket ball struck him, and the man who had helped spark a revolution crumpled to the ground. His death, witnessed by those around him, seared itself into memory. Though the British would soon claim the hill, the fall of Warren transformed the battle into something greater than a defeat. For the men who survived, his sacrifice was a beacon. They carried the story with them in retreat, telling others that Warren had chosen not safety, not command, but the front line, and had given his life as one of them. Breed's Hill was lost, but Warren's martyrdom gave the cause something the British could never reclaim. A hero whose death would echo through the revolution. The British bayonets pressed closer, cutting through the smoke and chaos. The earthworks that had blazed with fire now stood nearly silent. Muskets lay empty, powder horns dry. The rebels had spent their last shots, and the hill echoed only with the clash of steel. Colonel William Prescott gave the order no man wanted to hear. Retreat. But it was not a cry of panic. It was deliberate, disciplined, in order to withdraw before annihilation. The men who had dug through the night, who had twice repelled the might of empire, now pulled back step by step. They left behind their earthworks, their fallen brothers, and the blood-soaked soil of Breed's Hill. The retreat was no rout with powder gone. The colonists fought with the butts of their muskets, wielded farm tools, and even threw stones to slow the British advance. Yet most moved in measured steps, crossing Charlestown Neck under heavy artillery fire. Cannonballs ploughed the ground around them. Men fell in the crossing, but still they marched, battered, bleeding yet unbroken. Behind them, the Union Jack was planted atop the hill, marking a British victory. But it was a hollow prize. The cost was staggering. More than 1,000 casualties. Nearly half of Howe's force, officers and men alike, cut down in the assaults. The finest army in the world had taken the ground, but only at a price that sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. In London, the news stunned Parliament. A war that was supposed to end swiftly had already bled the empire heavily. If farmers and shopkeepers could stand against professional soldiers at Bunker Hill, what awaited the British in the years ahead? For the colonists, retreat did not feel like defeat. They had stood toe-to-toe with the most powerful military of the age, and twice sent them reeling down the hill. Their losses were grievous, yes, but their courage was proven in taverns and town halls across New England. The story spread like wildfire. The militia had fought with discipline, bravery, and resolve. They had shown that liberty could be defended with fire and steel. The Battle of Bunker Hill ended with the British flag over the hilltop. But in the hearts of the rebels, it ended with a revelation that the fight for independence was not hopeless. It was possible. The retreat was not surrender. It was a promise that they would return, stronger, better armed, and more determined than before. In that retreat, under smoke and fire, the revolution found its proof. When the smoke cleared over Charlestown, the British held the ground. Their banners snapped in the wind above the blackened hill, and their drums beat hollowly across the battlefield by every measure of territory. It was a victory, but to the men who had marched up that hill 3 times, stepping over their fallen comrades, it felt like anything but triumph. Of the roughly 2,200 soldiers who had charged, more than 1,000 lay dead or wounded. Entire companies had been cut to pieces. Nearly 1 in every 2 redcoats who fought that day never marched again. Among the dead were many of Howe's best officers, irreplaceable veterans whose loss left scars deeper than numbers could show. General Clinton would later admit, a few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America. For an empire that prided itself on power and efficiency, Bunker Hill revealed a bitter truth. The rebellion would not be easy to crush. On the colonial side, grief mingled with pride. They had lost the hill, yes, but not their spirit. The death of Joseph Warren stung deeply, yet it turned him into a martyr, his sacrifice immortalized in patriot memory. Ordinary farmers had stood against the king's soldiers and proved they could fight with courage and precision. News of the battle spread swiftly across New England. Men rushed to enlist, inspired by the defiance at Breed's Hill in Philadelphia. The Continental Congress hardened its resolve. George Washington, newly appointed commander of the Continental Army, heard of the battle while traveling north, and he understood at once. This war would be long, bloody, and unforgiving. For the British, Bunker Hill was a Pyrrhic victory. For the Americans, it was a spark, proof that resistance was possible, that liberty was worth bleeding for. The hill itself became less important than what it represented. That freedom, once fired upon, would not retreat forever. The Battle of Bunker Hill was over, but the revolution had only just begun. The Battle of Bunker Hill was more than a clash over a patch of ground. It was a crucible, a test of resolve that revealed what the war for independence would truly demand. The British carried the hill, but their victory was scarred by the staggering cost in blood. They had proven they could seize colonial positions, but only by sacrificing men at a rate no empire could sustain. The lesson struck deep in London. This was no minor uprising. It was a war. For the colonists, the retreat was not an ending but a beginning. Farmers, tradesmen, and laborers had faced the world's greatest army and lived to tell of it. Their courage gave birth to a conviction that liberty was not only worth fighting for, but possible to win. The story of Joseph Warren's sacrifice, the cries of "Hold your fire," and the sight of red ranks falling in waves became part of the mythology of a new nation. In the end, the battle's true prize was not the hill itself, but the belief it ignited. A belief that freedom could be defended, a belief that tyranny could be resisted, a belief that even in defeat, a people could discover their strength. Bunker Hill showed the world the price of liberty, and America, though bloodied, was willing to pay it.